In 1948, the body of a well-dressed man was found on Somerton Beach in Adelaide, Australia. He carried no identification. The labels had been removed from his clothing. Nobody came forward to claim him, and the investigation could not determine how or why he had died. What followed was a series of strange and seemingly inexplicable clues. Was he a spy? Had he been murdered? For more than 70 years, the Somerton Man remained unidentified, and his story became one of Australia's greatest unsolved mysteries. Then Professor Derek Abbott decided to investigate. What began as a university exercise became a search lasting more than a decade, filled with dead ends, failed DNA tests, and remarkable discoveries. Today, Derek reveals how he finally gave the Somerton Man his name. This is Professor Derek Abbott.
Thank you for having me here today.
It's a joy, it's a privilege. And as we go through our conversation today, we're going to talk about the Somerton Man. But I want to know who Derek Abbott is as a man. But before we even get there, what was childhood like?
Ooh, I wasn't expecting a question like that. Well, my childhood was very varied. My parents, for some reason, kept moving house a lot. And I think for my primary education, I went to quite a few schools, so it was very unsettling. And it was a strange childhood. It was a mixture of both neglect and privilege, if you know what I mean, all at the same time. To give you an example, my parents had me by accident when they were students, and so I was sent off as a baby to live with grandparents for a couple of years. And then when I came back, my father was still a student, but he had this harebrained scheme that he wanted to send me off to the most exclusive place in the UK. I grew up in the UK, by the way, to be looked after. This is a place called Norland, where it's like where royalty send their kids and things like that. And of course, they were just students and couldn't afford this, but he had this harebrained scheme, and he put all his full scholarship money into paying for that because it was very expensive. And so then there was nothing for them to live on. So he kept borrowing money from one of his brothers that lived in Philadelphia in America and was doing okay. And so on one hand, we're sort of on the poverty line, but on the other hand, I had this extreme privilege of being in this place. But it was a bit like, being in the Hogwarts. It was one of these living in this big mansion, and I'm like 3 years old, and so it's all a very strange experience. And so the early stage of my childhood was a little bit strange, going from school to school sometime. And this was a boarding thing from the age of 3 to 5. And so I had various other boarding school episodes in my primary education. So it was a little bit scary, but I guess it built resilience. And one of my boarding schools, I didn't really want to leave at the end, even though I hated it at the beginning. So it's amazing how they grow upon you. And my parents unfortunately got divorced when I was about 8, and my mother got remarried when I was about 11. So when it came about the time of high school, things started to settle down, and I stayed in the same school throughout my high school years. And and I kind of managed to settle in and get on with my education.
That's extraordinary. I've never heard of someone going to, one of the poshest schools that there is. And then obviously, having parents who are, deeply struggling. Was that because, so I'll put it this way. Was that for you? Did they send you to that school for your education? Or was it to satisfy like an ego style, look where our child goes to school? A combination of both? Where does that sit, do you think?
It's hard to say. I think there was a certain amount of guilt my parents had sending me away, and perhaps in their mind sending me to the best place they could possibly think of was a way to absolve some of that guilt.
Okay.
But the funny thing is, I did try to have conversations with them later in life when I was an adult, trying to suggest that they shouldn't feel guilty, because although I hated those places initially, I warmed to them and benefited from them in the end, and it built resilience. And it is part of who I am now. But they weren't listening. It was like they thought I was criticizing them, but I was just trying to show them the positive side of it. But I think there was so much guilt there that they just didn't even hear that I was trying to say, hey, it's okay. But they didn't hear that. So that's just one of those sad things.
I understand that. I know someone in my life who went to boarding school, and that same guilt kind of exists from their parents, and the relationship perhaps became somewhat strained. I'm not saying broke down completely. I'm not saying there was no love or anything like that, but perhaps the relationship was a step removed from, what you may define as a stereotypical kind of family relationship. It was, as you say, very Hogwarts is what they said as well. So yeah, I get that. So you obviously went to secondary education and you settled there. You were in one school.
Yeah.
I mean, what were you thinking about doing from that? You were going through high school and you thought to yourself, this is what I want to do. What was that thing?
Well, one of the funny things about my childhood is I never really knew what I wanted to do. And I always found it annoying when adults would come to me, if I was at a party or something, and they'd say, oh, what do you want to do when you grow up? And just to fob them off, because I really didn't know, I just used to say, I want to be a petrol pump attendant. That was my sense of humor. And that was just to get them to go away, basically. But as I got more towards secondary school, I did excel more in the sciences and maths and things like that. And so it did look like going in the sciences was the direction I wanted to be in. But I didn't know what exactly, because, I hate the sight of blood. So, medicine was out, and all my experiments with growing plants was out, died. So that was out, things to do with plants and, and biology and things. I couldn't remember all those long names and things like my very bad memory. So it just whittled down to a process of and chemistry. I just can't remember all those long chemical names. But that was my thinking at that age. And so it just kind of whittled down to things like physics and maths.
So you were obviously in a situation where, yes, you were looking at sciences, looking at maths. Where did that progress to?
Well, and I thought, I don't want to just go and do a degree in maths because that's just a bit dry just on its own. And how am I going to get a job with maths? That was my concern. And so I thought, I'm leaning towards physics because that was the only thing left. I liked physics because it didn't require memory. You can learn things from first principles and just work stuff out. Because I have a very bad memory, so I want to be in a subject which required as little memory as possible. That was my thinking, and I was just in high school one day, flicking through books in the library, and stumbled on this shelf that was a booklet with a list of companies that would take you on as a university student for what we called in Britain in those days a 131 sandwich course. I live in Australia now for the last 40 years, so I don't know if they still have those there, do they?
No.
Anyway.
They used to do a lot more of that, but I don't think it's as common anymore.
Yeah, so it basically meant you go and work for the company for 1 year, go to university for 3 years, and work at the company throughout all the holidays, so you got no rest, and then 1 year back at the company afterwards. And if they liked you, they'd give you a job. That was the plan. So I thought, yes, this is cool. I'll get a job at the end of this. And so it was a little thin green booklet. I still remember it. And so what I did is I just randomly selected 50 companies out of the book and typed out a little letter. And do you remember those old bander machines before we used to have photocopiers?
Yeah.
With alcohol. So I broke into one of the school offices, my high school offices, where they had a bander machine late one night and rolled out 50 copies of this letter that I had typed out, sent it all to this 50 companies and got 2 replies. One was from Philips, a company called Philips, and one was the General Electric company in Wembley. And I can't remember why I gave Philips the flick now, but I got interviewed and I decided to accept the General Electric company in Wembley. So that's why I did my sandwich course, and I did a degree in physics, and off I went to work for the General Electric company. And that's how I started.
And then, obviously, you worked for them. And how long were you there for? And where did you go from there?
So I started my sandwich with them, I think, end of 77, so properly in 1978. And I left them I did get a job there afterwards, but I left in 1986. So I was with them a little under 10 years, I guess. And it was in 86 that I flew off and emigrated here to Australia and been here ever since.
So what was the plan? Going to Australia, what was you going to do?
So the plan was, I should say what I was doing at the General Electric company. I was in the area of microchip design. So I was in the research labs in Wembley, where not too far from the Wembley Stadium where they have all those big concerts and things. So that's where it was. Unfortunately, that building, General Electric building, is gone now. It's all been smashed down since. Very sad, because it was a great place. loved it there, learnt a lot. And so, yeah, the plan was to come to Australia for better weather and to get a job here in the same area in chip design, working for a small company. I managed to get a job. And but alas, it was a small company, so it went down the gurgler very soon after I joined. And so did what most people do under those circumstances. I go back to university. So I went to the University of Adelaide here in Adelaide, where I'm based, and did basically a PhD because I only came out with a bachelor's. And I did the PhD in electrical engineering. That was the obvious thing to do because, you know, I had been working in the area of chip design and things like that. So my physics was more leaning towards the electronic stuff. So I did a degree in a PhD in that area. And then basically they sucked me in to become a full-time lecturer. And so I thought, yeah, why not? And it was interesting how that happened. I kind of bungled my way into becoming a lecturer, sort of almost accidentally. And then as I was doing it, you know, I was thinking to myself, actually, I remember now. I remember this is what I always wanted to do many years ago, around the age of 11 or 12, something like that. And I mentioned it to my mum, and she said, "Don't you dare ever do that. Teaching is a very bad area to be in." Da, da, da. And she totally wiped it out of my mind, and I totally forgot that was actually what I really wanted to do. And I thought, wow, I'm here now. And this was actually what I wanted to do, and I'd totally forgotten about it. And so that was great. And one of the things I sat down and thought about very carefully, because, you know, as a university lecturer, you're not only teaching, but you're doing research and scientific research and investigating things. And I actually really liked it. And one of the things I sat down to do, because I need to communicate this sort of stuff to students as well, because you have to try and inspire students to find their niche in life and what they wanted to do. And so I sat down and tried to work out what it is I really like about this. Why am I doing this? What does it really all boil down to? And I figured it out, and for me, what makes me tick is detective work. Following a lead and following it through and solving a problem. And that's what university research is all about. It's following leads and doing the research and solving the problem. And I realized when that penny dropped, and I realized that's what really makes me tick, is the detective work aspect of it. The penny dropped, and I realized that I would be truly happy doing anything with detective work, whether it be an archaeologist, a policeman, a detective, a historian, because this is all different forms of detective work, and it wouldn't matter to me what sort of detective work it was. It would be what kept me going. And so, but now I was there with my physics and my electronics, I stuck with it because that's the area I was. But as you'll find out when we tell the rest of the story and my involvement in the Somerton Man, it's all about detective work. Not only detective work, but history as well, and science and everything. It's all combined in that project. And so all my interests all came together into that focus. And so this is how my background really propels that project that hopefully we'll talk about.
It's brilliant. I love that. And thank you for that context, because it does explain everything. Now, Somerton Man, for someone who has never come across this, the facts of finding the Somerton Man and, let's say, the clues or the different elements that make this case, before you ever come to solve it, it's one of the most unusual. It is hugely fascinating. But I wonder if you could almost undo all of your detective work and tell us what was found, what the clues were, what the different elements were, before we look at how you unpicked those and actually what they all meant.
Okay. Shall I first start off by saying who the Somerton Man was and why it's a mystery and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah.
Okay, so this was an unsolved mystery that was unsolved for over 70 years in Adelaide, Australia. Basically, a man was found dead on a beach in 1948, and no one came to identify him. No one came to the police and say, okay, this is my son or my father or my husband or whatever, or brother. Nobody did that. And it seemed that this guy was not a drifter. He looked in good condition. He had very nice trimmed nails that were clean, and he had a nice suit, very spit polished shoes, and he was just inexplicably found dead on a beach one day. And it got a lot of press in Australia over the years, and there are various things that kind of gave the case some mystique. It was found in one of his fob pockets inside his trousers. That was a tiny little piece of paper rolled up in there, because he had no ID on him, and so the police and investigators at the time were very keen to go through all his possessions and try and find the slightest clue as to his identification. And the best thing they could come up was this tiny little paper that was all rolled up and stuffed into his fob pocket. And when you unrolled it, it just had some letters in print. It was printed, so it looked like it was torn out of a book. And all it said was Tamám Shud. And the police at the time didn't even know what that meant. And so they published this in the papers and said, does anyone know what this is? And actually one of the reporters from the paper actually knew what it was, and so put his hand up. And he said, yes, it's the last two words in a poetry book called the Rubáiyát of Omar Khayyám, which was a very popular book in the day, and people today still know it quite well, those who are into poetry. And these words are Persian, Tamám Shud, meaning it's finished, it's in the past tense. And it's at the end of the book, so one assumes it's the part of the book that's basically trying to say the end. And it's ominous that that's the bit that's in his pocket. He's saying, this is the end. So police interpreted that as a little bit of a suicide note, perhaps. So it was never, ever classed as a homicide. And they never went to the lengths that one might do with tracking down a killer or something when a homicide is involved, because it was like an unidentified man, suspected suicide. They did go beyond their call of duty, I must say, and did quite a lot of investigation, but not to the level as if it was a homicide. And so there were a few things missed as a result, but that's life. And this poor chap went by unidentified for over 70 years. And so I came along to Australia in 86. I never even heard of the case till about 95 when I saw it in a magazine, just flicking through a magazine one day about Australia's unsolved mysteries, and this was one of them. Another mystery that was like on top of the list of the compilation that I read was, I don't know if your listeners know about this, but we had a whole prime minister in Australia once disappear. His name was Harold Holt, and so this is regarded as like the greatest mystery, and the Somerton Man was the second greatest mystery.
Yeah, Jimmy Hoffa and these mysterious people who've disappeared. Yes. Yeah, that's interesting.
So, in America, Jimmy Hoffa disappeared and was never found. But in Australia, we can go one up on Jimmy Hoffa because we have a whole prime minister disappear. So, so yes, interesting. But anyway, it got my curiosity. This was around 95, and I hadn't heard of it. But then nothing happened till about 2007 when I saw another article in a newspaper about this case. And this was a different article now. It wasn't a tiny little article in a magazine. It was a full center page spread, of the newspaper. So it's a huge article, lots of photos and details. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. And apparently, the poetry book that the letters Tamám Shud were torn out of were actually found by the police at the time. And it seems that there were some letters lightly penciled on the back of the poetry book that seemed to be like a secret code. They seemed to be letters that made no sense. And so I actually saw a photo of that in this article. And so I thought, oh, this is a very interesting thing. This will be a good exercise for my students. I will set this as an exercise to statistically test these letters to actually see if they're even a code in the first place or not. So I didn't set it as an exercise to crack the code because I didn't even know if it was or not. I set it as an exercise to determine if it is likely to be a code or not. And so we did lots of various tests, and I had, over a number of years, I had different groups of students working on this. And it came up time and time again that no, this is not a code. It doesn't have the sophistication of a code. It's just the first letters of words in the English language. And we tested this hypothesis against lots of different languages, and English always came up number one. And first letters of words came up number one rather than any words in the body of the word. And so was just like a long acronym, if you like, aide de mémoire. Because there was about 50 letters in this thing, so you can't really call it an acronym as such. So it's anybody's guess what it could mean. So that became a bit of a dead end, but I'd gone down the rabbit hole so far because I'd studied the history of this case and the history of the times in Adelaide to kind of get context. And so I had dug up a lot of information, and it occurred to me that there was something I could actually solve now. And I ditched the idea of the code, and I thought, I think it's solvable to find the man's identity. And so that's what I went on to do next. Interesting.
It's interesting because you look at the great mysteries, and these are some of the most popular mysteries in the world. Things like D.B. Cooper, the Zodiac, There are Jimmy Hoffa, we've mentioned one, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. There are lots and lots and lots of mysteries that perhaps will never be solved. There is a reasonable chance that some of the ones I've just mentioned, and the greatest of them all, perhaps Jack the Ripper, certainly the most infamous, and that's not going to be solved conclusively. I don't even know what would have to happen. But you had one of these cases that for 70 years, unsolved. It is reasonable to say that that was a case that was never going to be worked out. Not necessarily what happened, but who that was. That could have lain dormant for all of time. And as more time passed, obviously, the less chance. So you decided, I'm going to find out who this is. How do we do this? How do we even start to work this out?
Yeah. So the approach I decided is this was around 2009 that I was deciding this. And it happened that, around that time, just a bit before 2009, some of these kind of websites started to come into being, Family Tree DNA and websites like that, where you put your DNA on this website and you can find all your closest cousins around the world, wherever they may be. This is for people who want to trace their family trees. And I said, this is the way I'm going to solve it. I'm going to put his DNA up on here, find out his nearest relatives, and can trace him from that. And this is 2009, way before anybody did the Golden State Killer or anything like that. And so everyone thought I was nuts. So I even mentioned it to the police, etc., and they just looked at me blank. They had no idea what I was talking about. Because you see, the thing about police DNA tests is they only use 23 bits of information of the DNA. It's not much. And that's because they're comparing DNA of from actual DNA on a crime scene with the DNA of a suspect. And so they're doing a one-to-one matching. But when you're doing DNA, or putting your DNA on one of these websites, it's a one-to-many match. You're trying to match to tens of thousands of people around the world to find a cousin somewhere. Hundreds of thousands, in fact. So it's a completely different ballgame. You don't use 23 bits of information. You can use anything up to 2 million on those websites. So you've actually got 2 million bits of your DNA information on there. So it's completely different from the police DNA test. And so back in 2009, everyone thought I was nuts. They didn't realize that this is the ball game. It's not 23 bits of information anymore. So they had no idea. But anyway, I was determined to do it. And luckily, it turns out that the coroner in 1948 decided, just before burying the Somerton Man, that they would make a plaster bust and make an effigy of him. And this plaster bust was molded directly off the body. So they actually made a plaster mold off the dead body, and then through that mold made a plaster bust of the man. And the idea of doing that was so that after he's buried, if anyone came forward to try and identify him, they would show them the bust. As it turned out, it was completely useless, and no one hardly came forward to look at the bust. A few people did, but the bust was useless because, it was molded off his dead body after the dead body had been in a fridge for 6 months. And so a lot of his features had changed and flattened, and it didn't really look like him anymore, but he looked quite different. So it was completely useless as a sort of an effigy, but it was a gold mine in DNA because it was molded directly off his body. It had his hairs embedded in it, in the plaster. And you knew they were his hairs straight off his body because the hairs were sticking up on end, on point, out of the plaster, all in a nice little pattern. So you knew this was genuine. So I got permission from the police around, I think it was around 2010, 9, somewhere around there, to go to the bust and actually extract hairs out of the plaster. I won't go into all the details how we did. There's a huge long story of what we went through to do that, etc., etc. But I'll cut a long story short and say we managed to get quite a few nice hair samples. And over the years, we used our DNA labs at the university to try and get a DNA sequence out of these hairs. And each time we failed. So the first time we did it was a complete failure. Didn't get a thing out of it, but at least the hair stained positive for DNA. So we got a stain test that said, hey, there is DNA in here. And that was important because, you see, the body was embalmed in formaldehyde, and that normally messes. The correct technical word is cross-links the DNA, but I'll just say messes up the DNA for the audience. And so a lot of naysayers that believed I was barking up a dead alley said, you'll never get anything out of this because the body was embalmed. But this gave me hope that there's still some viable DNA in this hair that perhaps the embalming fluid didn't reach. And so we tried it again 3 years later, and we got a few bits of DNA information, enough to say what the Somerton Man's DNA group that she belonged to, because, you know, DNA comes in various different groupings depending on your ethnicity. And unfortunately, the Somerton Man's mother had an ethnicity that was very broad and could basically be anywhere in Europe. So it didn't tell us any information we didn't already know. So that was disappointing on one hand, but on the other hand, I got excited because it's like much more DNA information that we got the first time. And then we did it another time, another 3 years later, and so on. And each time we did it every 3 years, it got better and better, and we got more and more information out of it. And finally, one of the last tests we did at the university, we got the whole mitochondrial genome from the Somerton Man's hair. So it's all the information on his mother's side of the family, in other words. But the catch is, although that's impressive to get the whole mitochondrial genome, it's not the part of the DNA that is used by websites like Ancestry.com, etc. They don't use that part of the DNA at all. They use a different part of the DNA called the autosomes. And our autosomal trace that we got from that was abysmal. We only got about 20,000 bits of information, which sounds like a lot, but Ancestry.com need 2 million. They don't use 20,000. So 20,000 is abysmal compared to 2 million. So it still wasn't good enough. 20,000 is so small that no websites will even allow you to upload such a small file and try and compare it with anything. Because it's so small, it would just basically give you false results. It would just match with anything out there. So it would be no good. And then finally, we finally cracked it when we did another final test. I decided in the end to have another crack with a lab in America that had a speciality of extracting DNA from hair. And I was determined to not let the hair out of my sight, that I would pack it in my suitcase and personally fly off to America and hand deliver it to the lab in America. This was my big plan. But guess what happened? COVID came along and I couldn't travel anymore. So I thought, oh my God, what bad luck. But then I decided to bite the bullet, post it in an envelope, and send it off, and risk the post. And the funny thing was, it came back. It didn't get lost in the post, thankfully, but the lab did it. And guess what? It was a flop. They couldn't get anything out of this damn hair. It was heartbreaking. And so, and I sent them my best hair route as well. And I thought, damn, that's terrible. So, kind of a little bit out of desperation, I had this nice segment of hair shaft. I forget how long it was. I think it was probably only about 1 centimeter. And I thought, okay, let's give this a shot because, I've got nothing to lose here. So I sent this hair shaft off. And because they claim to be able to get DNA out of hair shaft, which is difficult. And bingo, we got a great result. We got actually 2 million bits of information. It wasn't all the 2 million that, say, Ancestry.com use, but 1 million of them were the correct ones. So that was great. And 1 million is enough to get by, to do an identification. And so that was very exciting getting that back from them. And and so immediately we're able to upload this file, and I got help from a colleague in America by the name of Colleen Fitzpatrick, who's an expert in this area and also drawing up family trees from the people that we find. And so we found the closest match we found was a chap in another state in Australia, in a state called Victoria, where the capital Melbourne is. And this chap was a descendant of one of the Somerton Man's sisters. And something like, I forget whether it was grandson or great-grandson of one of the sisters, something like that. Probably great-grandson of a sister. Anyway, so quite far removed, and this is somebody who would never have even heard of the case or never even met the Somerton Man himself or whatever. And Colleen and I think it took us about 3 months. We built a family tree from this guy's details. And this family tree had about 4,000 people on it. It was a huge family tree we developed. And so the next step was to go through this family tree and try and find somebody who had gone missing or didn't have a date of death or something like that. And it's a long shaggy dog story of how we processed this family tree of 4,000 people. I won't go through all the gory details because we could be here for a whole other podcast just on that. But basically, to cut a long story short, we eventually found the guy we were looking for, and his name was Charles Webb. And we knew we'd got him with certainty when we found that he was related to the chap that whose DNA matched the Somerton Man. And what we're able to do was find other brothers and sisters of Charles Webb and trace their descendants down. And we even found his mother and trace descendants of the mother's sister down. And it's interesting, a lot of them were all in Victoria, in Melbourne, Victoria. Some weren't, but many of them were. So they're concentrated in this geographical area. And I was able to contact them, ring them up. So I did a bit of detective work to find out who they were and get their contact details. That's an interesting story in itself, how I go about doing that. That's all a bit tricky, but I managed to do it. Contact them and say, hey, would you mind putting your DNA on Ancestry.com, please? So thankfully, a lot of them were interested in doing it. Didn't get much pushback. One guy did feel that he didn't want to do it, so dobbed in his sister. Sorry, that's an Australian expression, dob in. Do you say that in UK these days?
I know it. I wouldn't say it was...
Yeah.
But yeah, dobbing in,
Dobbed in his sister, and she got the DNA done. And then when she did it and got a matched result, he said, all right, I'll do mine then. And so he got in it. And all these other relatives and other descendants, they all connected to the Somerton Man's DNA, to Charles Webb. And not only did they connect to it, but they connected it with the mathematically correct amount of overlap for that relationship. So within that sort of, there's certain bounds which you can match within, and they all came within those correct bounds. So that was fantastic. So we had a lot of confirmation. And so as soon as that was all confirmed, it was snapped up by the New York Times the next day. And so they wrote up a big article, and the rest is history. And as we were doing this, I did some historical research on Charles Webb and who he was. And it turns out that he was the son of a baker. His dad was a German immigrant. His dad's real name was Weber, but obviously shortened it to just Webb when he immigrated. And so he grew up in Victoria, worked in his dad's bakery. And he actually qualified with electrical qualifications. He did a kind of a diploma in electrical engineering in Victoria, but decided to work in his dad's bakery anyway. And then when his dad died and sold bakery in 1939, Charles then got married and then actually really did do an electrical job and worked in a factory making cordless hand drills. And that's what he basically did. It seems he split up with his wife. They separated. Unfortunately, it was a bit of an unhappy marriage. And then the next we find him dead on a beach in Adelaide. And so it's all a bit of a mystery what he was doing there, why he actually died. The autopsy did show that his liver was in very bad condition. So at the very least, he wasn't well, and probably would have died anyway, whatever happened to him. Another interesting thing is one of his brothers died as a prisoner of war in World War II, but his other brothers and sisters died very shortly after him anyway, and they were older than him, a little older than him, and died shortly after. So, and they all died of the same thing. They all died of blocked arteries in their hearts. They were all smokers as well. This chap probably didn't have, judging from his siblings, probably didn't have long to go himself either. So it's all a bit sad. And one can see why no one came forward to identify him back in the day, because, the family was quite fragmented. It's just after World War II, and his siblings were dying off themselves. It was all, it's all very sad, really, when you look back at it.
So there were obviously those clues that were on, which led people to say everything from, and I'm paraphrasing probably badly, everything from a ballerina, because something to do with his calf muscles. There was Russian spy. There was all kinds of, let's say, hypotheses of what this man was, what he was doing there. And you were able to actually, because of obviously finding out who he was, I think work out how some of these things link to him.
Yes. Well, so the fact that when we put his DNA up on the website, it clustered all around people living in Melbourne, Victoria, and not a single skerrig of Russian DNA in there, we were easily able to eliminate the Russian spy hypothesis immediately. Yes, and people hypothesized that he had very strong calf muscles that were high up the calf, and possibly that's a sign of a ballet dancer or somebody who does calf raises a lot. And but that's not a surefire thing, and it turns out he wasn't a ballet dancer. He just worked in a bakery. But we were able to dig up facts about his life, and it does seem he was pretty sporty, and he did community football and things like that. And so there are some newspaper articles with him being in football matches. So and he played racket sports as well. So he was a pretty fit guy. So, a combination of good genetics and keeping fit could explain those calf muscles. It doesn't have to be a ballet dancer necessarily. There was another hypothesis, and I haven't told you this part of the story yet, because this is where it connects to my life. Would you like me to go into this?
Love to.
Well, it turns out that this poetry book that had all these code letters on the back also had some phone numbers. And one of the phone numbers belonged to somebody who had trained as a nurse, who only lived 5 minutes walk from where he was found dead. But the police never released her identity, and so she was always a little bit murky and mysterious. And so in the early days when I was investigating this case, before I'd found his identity, one of the lines of attack I did was to say, well, let's try and find out who this lady is. And so I managed to find out who she was, because there was enough information in the newspapers about her that gave it away. Like, they actually said where she had trained as a nurse. They gave the name of the hospital, and they said, she lived very close to where the body was found dead and things like that. So by piecing together nursing records from that hospital together with electoral roll records that give the names of the people living in the area at the time, I was able to piece things together and find her identity. And her name was Jo Thompson. And unfortunately, by the time I'd figured out her name and how to possibly contact her, she had actually died 2 years earlier. And so I thought to myself, okay, so does she have any descendants? So I found that she had a son who, incidentally, was a ballet dancer.
No way.
And so I didn't know that the ballet dancer hypothesis was rubbish back then. So I thought, oh, that's an interesting coincidence. So son is a ballet dancer, and people are saying the Somerton Man might be a ballet dancer. Could there be a connection here? So I found out who the son was, and he was a pretty good ballet dancer, and he worked for the Australian ballet company, and he worked for the Royal Ballet in New Zealand. And so he worked for the Royal Ballet in New Zealand, and he also worked for the ballet company in Switzerland, the Basel Ballet Company. So he did the rounds for a fair bit, and he toured America on various shows that were touring America with Rudolf Nureyev, so, you have to be pretty good when you're doing all that. And I thought, wow, this is interesting. But sadly, by the time I'd figure out who he was and how to contact him, he had virtually just recently died. So the very same year that I figured out who he was, he died. He died of prostate cancer, unfortunately. So that was very, very sad. So I thought, oh, damn, that was another roadblock. And so I thought, well, does he have any descendants? So I was going down the line because maybe a descendant might know something. And so found that he had a daughter and contacted her, and she was alive, thankfully. And so I went to interview her, and the daughter was completely useless because she'd never even heard of the case, didn't know anything about it. But we ended up getting married.
No way.
Yeah.
No.
Oh, you didn't know that part of the story.
That's
okay.
incredible.
So this was back in around 2010. And so we're still married and have 3 lovely kids as a result. And so that was a bit crazy. So, one of the hypothesis of back in those days is, could she be a descendant of the Somerton Man? Because, her dad was born out of wedlock and had these calf muscles like the Somerton Man. And there were other features that matched the Somerton Man as well. Like he had canine teeth that weren't in the right place. Those canine teeth were next to his center teeth, which is a fairly rare condition. And the Somerton Man had the same condition, just like her dad. So I thought, oh, this is all rather a lot of coincidences. And there were other coincidences too, not just those. And so it didn't seem such a bad hypothesis that she could be related to the Somerton Man. And so one of the things we did when we got his DNA, in fact, this is the first thing I did, is I compared it against my wife's DNA. And there wasn't a single tiniest match anywhere.
Wow.
No match. 0. Absolute 0. So no relation whatsoever, not even distant one. So that was eliminated immediately. And so interesting. So all those fascinating coincidences between her dad and the Somerton Man all just vaporized. But it's an interesting lesson that you got to be wary of coincidences when they're not backed up by by solid facts. And but when coincidences are all you've got to go on, it makes what's called a hypothesis. So it's a hypothesis. It's not necessarily the truth yet, but it's a hypothesis that's waiting to be confirmed or eliminated. So that's the way we always saw that, as a hypothesis. But of course, the press love to grab onto that and blow it up into more than a hypothesis, but that's what the press does. And so it had that sort of aura that it might be the truth, but it wasn't.
But it still changed your life. It's incredible.
But it changed my life, yes.
I've got a question for you. And so I'm going to go back. Genetic genealogy. So obviously the most famous case of this recently is Joseph James DeAngelo, the Golden State Killer, who was found because they were able to access a rape kit that contained Joseph James DeAngelo's DNA, which was then put into GEDmatch, and through, yes, a combination of incredibly sophisticated things that you also did, a match was able to be found with a family member that was fundamentally then put into a family tree. They were able to go through the family tree, get to, I think, 2 people. They actually thought it might be the other one momentarily, but obviously found out that it was indeed Joseph James DeAngelo. But you were talking about genetic genealogy a long time ago. Was there anybody else who had even come up with this as a possible concept, or was you really literally the groundbreaker of something now that has solved a lot of cases?
Well, I think I was probably the very first person talking about it in Australia for the time, because everyone thought I was mad back then. But I do believe there may have been some people already in America working on that sort of stuff back then, but it would have been quite embryonic back then. So I don't think I was the very first in the whole world to have thought of that. But yeah, definitely the first in Australia, I'd say.
But certainly in the, you were right at the cutting edge of something utterly groundbreaking, which has actually now solved, a significant amount of cases. Now, there is obviously, and I'm going to ask you this question, and, there is obviously this ethical side of this.
Yes, let's get into that.
Yeah, let's do it. There is obviously this ethical side that potentially someone in good faith, let's say, has uploaded their DNA in order to seek out their own ancestors. Then police / citizen sleuths and are then obviously using these databases to now use the DNA which is in there, not to identify someone necessarily like you did, but to find potentially a killer or some other person who has committed, some horrible crime. And they are then getting a knock, like DeAngelo, on the door whilst he's cooking a chicken one day, and they're told, we're arresting you for something that happened, a long time ago. Now, it's a brilliant that it brings closure to so many people, and it's solving cases. But from your perspective, is this the greatest thing that has ever had been a breakthrough in criminal prosecution, or is it a road to something far worse?
Yeah. That's a very interesting question. So let me answer this in a couple of layers. So I'd first like to say that if you're using it to solve a case where you're trying to find a killer, and I believe this was done in the Golden State Killer case, is they only used it to create a hypothesis that this chap was the killer. They didn't use it as court evidence, so they just used it to profile him first, and then once they found him, they tracked him down. And I've forgotten the details. I think they saw him getting out of a car and throwing a paper drinking cup on the ground or something that he'd been drinking from. And he walked off and they grabbed the cup and DNA tested the cup, something like that. I can't remember if it was a cup or something else, but it was something like that. And it was then from the traditional DNA test that became the court evidence, not this thing. So what one can do is use this approach as an initial screening to find your suspect, but then you have to then use traditional policing methods to create the courtroom type evidence. So you have these different layers of security, if you see what I mean.
Yes.
So that's one level of it. There's another level of all this, and that is you as an individual saying, well, do I really want to put my DNA on this website to find my relatives if police are going to be coming knocking on my door at some time in the future? My attitude is, or my DNA is up on these websites too, and my attitude is, if I have a relative that's such a heinous killer as a Golden State Killer, I don't care if it's my relative or not. I want them locked up. So yeah, it doesn't worry me from that perspective. Where it might become a worry is our governments that we live in our what we think are what we call our Western societies, relatively benign at the moment. But what if things change in the future and they become authoritarian and they start hauling us up on our DNA for minor things, not for being serial killers, but for, touching the door handle of Buckingham Palace or whatever it is, just a silly example. Who knows where it could all end. Yeah, that's a tricky thing. That's a tricky decision people have to make for themselves. I hope it never comes to that. Were there any other ethical perspectives you were thinking of?
I think the way you've just summarized that, I agree with you. I would be delighted if the police or any citizen sleuth was able to highlight that someone who was related to me had done something horrific, if they'd done something horrific, even if that, it's unforgivable, the crimes that these people did. I agree with you, though, that obviously it could be used to solve things which are petty crimes, things that, yes, really it should not be used for. I mean, you did a lot of investigation here, and we've skirted over it because I know we could talk for hours and hours and hours. You obviously used other techniques to track down people, and you were doing so and under the guise of trying to solve this mystery. I mean, my question to you is, there are a lot of cases in the world, and we've mentioned some of them today, like the D.B. Coopers and the Zodiacs and the Jack the Rippers, and where people they're going after people. And this isn't what you did, but they're going and saying, right, This person, I believe, committed this crime because of circumstantial evidence normally. But they're doing their own investigations and speaking to people. And there are some similarities to probably how you track down certain people and bits of information. And I'm wondering, how much liaison did you have with the police? How many people kind of knew what you were doing from a kind of, I guess, in a university kind of ethical perspective? And do you have any words of warning for, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable?
Yes. Well, the police were aware I was working on this, and so they were fully aware. And once we had cracked it, of course, I informed them immediately. In terms of university where I work, it's quite interesting, the different reactions to the ethics of it. It kind of depended on which department you were in, because I did worry about the ethics, and I did a particular ethical angle I was worried about. This is before I knew whether my wife was related or not. I was wondering whether it was ethical that I work on this case, given that my wife is a possible descendant. Should I be working on something like this, and it turns out that she is, so I'm using university resources for something that's personal. So this was another ethical perspective to think about. And so not the ethics you were thinking about, but I thought I'll broaden this conversation out. And so this did worry me in the early days, and I did worry about it. And I consulted a very distinguished ethicist who was living in Canada that I knew. And I said to her, I explained to her the whole situation, and I said, is this like a conflict of interest that, let's say my wife's related and I'm working on this in company time on something that could be personal? And she said, no, this is not a conflict of interest. She said, this is an alignment of interest in this case. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting perspective. But then I also talked to various people from different departments, people in the science departments said, oh, yeah, this is a conflict of interest. You shouldn't be doing this. And people in engineering, which is where I'm based, didn't say that. They said, this is just a perceived conflict of interest. So long as you keep your head of a department informed and your dean and your vice chancellor, you should be fine. And so I did. I followed that advice and made sure whoever was in power at the time there was informed that I was doing this, and there's a possible perceived conflict of interest. And then when I talked to people in the medicine department, this is interesting, they said, conflict of interest? No, that's not a conflict of interest. Don't be silly. Their attitude was totally different in medicine. They said, the only reason why we work on anything in medicine, why we take an interest in a particular disease or curing a particular thing or blah, 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 is because we've got a relative who's got it. That's why we do what we do. So working on something just because your relative has got something is not a conflict of interest. So they were very definite about that. So it was interesting to see this whole spectrum of different responses to the ethics of. And then, as it turned out, when I tested my wife's Somerton Man against my wife's DNA, there was no relation at all. I took a big sigh of relief and go, phew, at least the people in the science department won't hate me anymore now. So yes, that's how it was.
Do you think there is something to be cautious of, though? People taking on these cases and just running with them and, coming up with their own conclusions. I mean, you were earlier on, you said to me about that, that there are lots of things that happen.
Yes.
And you kind of look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. That's a coincidence. So that's another coincidence that could be useful. Do you have a word of warning? Because you really have done something that a lot of people would love to do. You've actually solved part of this mystery.
I think something like this is probably a little bit tricky for, just a member of the public to do it like this, just to go out and do that, because there could be dangers in doing that. And but in my case, it's a little bit different because I'm working in a university environment. And being in a university environment, I'm a professional at investigating things and doing research and thinking about the ethics of what I'm doing and have experience in following certain protocols and doing things in particular ways. And, I followed all the careful protocols one does when one goes about doing these things. And, when I spoke to descendants of this Somerton Man, I was very careful not to tell them this was the Somerton Man case. I just said it's a case out of possibly others, and we just need to check to see if you're related or not. And so I kept it general. Because one of the protocols is you're not really supposed to tell people, the actual people, what you're working on. There's various reasons why it's not a good idea. And and things like that. And then the other thing was I very carefully did it so that their DNA was always under their control. I never really got to see their DNA. They tested themselves. They sent their DNA off to Ancestry.com, paid for it themselves, did it of their own volition, and uploaded it themselves to familydna.com. And then I gave them instructions. Ancestry.com, and then I gave them instructions how to upload it onto GEDmatch. And once it's on GEDmatch, I can just at a press of a button go ping, does it connect or not to the Somerton Man? And so I was totally hands-off. I was at a total hands-off distance from the descendants and not touching their DNA or having anything to do with their privacy. So that was another protocol. Another protocol I followed very carefully, and general members of the public might not do this carefully enough, is I was very careful with any descendants to only name them in publications and things like that if they had already named themselves, like certain descendants have, of their own free will, have gone on television and have been interviewed, and so their names are in the public domain, and so I can mention their actual names now. one of the descendants actually tweeted and said, "Hey, I'm the grand blah 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 of the Somerton Man." And so once they've done that, that's okay now to mention that person's name. But any descendant that who has not released their name of their own volition, I have always kept their name secret. I have not released those. So I've been very careful to follow those sorts of protocols.
That's a lesson to everybody. And, the thing with these mysteries are you can go down rabbit holes. You can become extremely invested. And who are you now today? You have solved who the Somerton Man was. Are you going to do something again? Are you going to look at another case? Is this the end of the detective in you?
Oh, the detective in me never ends, because I'm always doing some detective work in my own everyday research at the university. My bread and butter stuff is all detective work. Everything I do is. So yes, it never stops. But whether I do something with this to do with dead people or not, I don't know. Because I got this experience, I think if I ever did another one, I could do it a lot more efficiently and quickly. So if the police ever knocked on my door and were desperate to get a particular case done very fast, and twisted my arm, I would possibly do it. But I don't think I'll do one of my own volition. I'm too busy with too many other things.
I understand.
So that's how I see it.
Well, you've done something that the majority of people in this life will never do. You are certainly, believe me, a hero amongst the kind of mystery world of actually being able to solve one, because that's the point with these. And there are so many websites, so many different lists. And Somerton Man was on that list, the 30 greatest mysteries, the 10, most unsolved. And there it was. And you were able to do that. And I hope that brings you a great sense of satisfaction, but also, the closure that you have given to even if the family members didn't know who that person was, were not aware of them. You have been able to bring that sense of closure, but particularly to the chapter of the Somerton Man's actual story. We may not know all the answers of why he was there and everything, the entire autobiography, but you've certainly given people, if anyone wants to take that on and look further into ethically, I might add, there's always stories to find.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for what you've done, and thank you for such an interesting story and being part of this. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure talking to you.
And, I wish you well, and I wish you well. And if the police do knock on that door with something, interesting,
I'll try my best.
I'm sure you will. But, the one thing that I always say is, it's genuinely fascinating. I loved hearing this story. So from me to you and for everybody listening, thank you so much.